Part 3, Chapter 8 of The Wrong of Slavery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wrong of Slavery, the Right of Emancipation, and the Future of the African Race in the United States by Robert Dale Owen. Part 3, Chapter 8. The freedman needs mere temporary aid or supervision. As regards the question what amount of aid and interference is necessary or desirable to enable the freedman to tide over the stormy transition from slavery to freedom, it is certain that there is as much danger in doing too much as in doing too little. The risk is serious that, under the guise of guardianship, slavery in a modified form may be practically restored. Those who have ceased only perforce to be slaveholders will be sure to unite their efforts to effect just such a purpose. It should be the earnest object of all friends of liberty to anticipate and prevent it. Benevolence itself, misdirected, may play into the hands of freedom's enemies, and those whose earnest endeavor is the good of the freedman may unconsciously contribute to his virtual re-enslavement. The refugees from slavery, when they first cross our lines, need temporary aid, but not more than indigent Southern whites fleeing from secessionism, both being sufferers from the disturbance of labor and the destruction of its products incident to war. The families of colored men, hired as military laborers or enlisted as soldiers, need protection and assistance, but not more than the families of white men similarly situated. Forcibly deprived of education in a state of slavery, the freedmen have a claim upon us to lend a helping hand until they can organize schools for their children. But they will soon take the labor and expense out of our hands, for these people pay no charge more willingly than that which assures them that their children shall reap those advantages of instruction which were denied to themselves. If we organize a Freedman's Bureau, it should be borne in mind that we need its agency as a temporary alleviation, not because these people are Negroes, only because they are men who have been, for generations, deprived of their rights. Extensive experience in the West Indies has proved that emancipation, when it takes place, should be unconditional and absolute. The experiment of a few years' apprenticeship, plausible in theory, proved in practice a failure so injurious in its effects that the provincial legislatures, though they had been opposed to the abolition of slavery, voted after trial for the abolition of apprenticeship. The freedman should be treated at once as any other free man. He should be subjected to no compulsory contracts as to labor. There should not be, directly or indirectly, any statutory rates of wages. There should be no interference between the hirers and the hired, nor should any restrictions be imposed in regard to the local movements of these people, except such regulations incident to war, relative to vagrancy or otherwise, as apply equally to whites. The natural laws of supply and demand should be left, in all cases, to regulate rates of compensation and places of residence. When freedmen shall have voluntarily entered into any agreement to work, they may at first usefully be aided in reducing that agreement to writing, and for a time we may properly see to it that such freedmen do not suffer from ill treatment or failure of contract on the part of their employers, and that they themselves perform their duty in the premises. But all aid given to these people should be regarded as a temporary necessity. All supervision over them should be provisional only, and advisory in its character. The sooner they can learn to stand alone and to make their own unaided way, the better for our race and for theirs. End of Part 3, Chapter 8. Part 3, Chapter 9 of The Wrong of Slavery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wrong of Slavery, the Right of Emancipation, and the Future of the African Race in the United States by Robert Dale Owen. Part 3, Chapter 9, the sum of our duty towards the Negro race. The essential is that we secure to them the means of making their own way, that we give them, to use the familiar phrase, a fair chance. If, like whites, they are to be self-supporting, then, like whites, they ought to have those rights, civil and political, without which they are but laboring as a man labors with hands bound. There will, for some time to come, be a tendency on the part of many among those who have heretofore held them in bondage, still to treat them in an unjust and tyrannical manner. The effectual remedy for this is not special enactments or a special permanent organization for the protection of colored people, but the safeguard of general laws applicable to all against fraud and oppression. The sum of our recommendations is this: offer the freedmen temporary aid and counsel until they become a little accustomed to their new sphere of life. Secure to them, by law, their just rights of person and property. Relieve them, by a fair and equal administration of justice, from the depressing influence of disgraceful prejudice. Above all, guard them against the virtual restoration of slavery in any form, under any pretext, and then let them take care of themselves. If we do this, the future of the African race in this country will be conducive to its prosperity and associated with its well-being. There will be nothing connected with it to excite regret or inspire apprehension. End of Part 3, Chapter 9. Appendices to the Wrong of Slavery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wrong of Slavery, the Right of Emancipation, and the Future of the African Race in the United States by Robert Dale Owen. Appendix 1. Note A, page 61. Since the calculations in the text relative to the mortality chargeable to the African slave trade and to the number of slaves imported were made, some confirmatory documents have come under my observation. I had assumed as the average deportation of slaves 120,000 a year from 1788 to 1840, and 65,000 a year only from 1840 to 1848, pages 36 and 37. Mr. Buxton, in his African Slave Trade, after supplying elaborate details, thus sums up the total for 1839, the year in which he wrote, quote, "I limit myself to the facts which I have established, namely, that there are at the present time annually imported into Brazil 78,333, that the annual importations into Cuba amount to 60,000, that there have been captured 8,294, and I assume that the casualties amount to 3,373, making together 150,000. Close quote. This estimate is for those actually landed, as Mr. Buxton estimates, page 169, the number lost on the passage at 25% on those landed, or 37,500 out of 150,000. This gives his estimate of the deportation from Africa in the year 1839 at 187,500. And this was at the time when two nations only, Brazil and Spain, remained as customers of the slaver. The estimate is at least double mine. Mr. Buxton's estimate agrees with mine in the calculation that for every Negro shipped, another, quote, must have been sacrificed in the seizure, march, and detention, close quote, page 169. He calculates further that of those actually landed, quote, 20% die in the seasoning, close quote, page 169. He quotes the celebrated William Pitt as saying during the debate on the slave trade in 1791, quote, "The evidence before the House as to the mortality was perfectly clear, for it would be found in that dreadful catalogue of deaths in consequence of the seasoning in the middle passage, which the House had been condemned to look into, that 1/2 die," close quote, pages 160 and 161. Various travelers in Africa furnish items going to show the loss of life in Africa as compared to the slaves obtained. Denham, the noted traveler, says, quote, "In one instance 20,000 were killed for 16,000 carried away into slavery." Close quote. In another, quote, "Probably more than double," close quote, "the number of those captured were killed by the captors." Dr. Holroyd, an African traveler who returned from Nubia and Kordofan in 1838, wrote under date January 14 to Mr. Buxton, quote, "There is not only a terrible waste of life in the attempts to capture the Negroes, but after they are seized there is so much of ill usage and brutality that I have been assured no less than 30% perish in the first 10 days after their seizure." Close quote. This from Buxton's African Slave Trade, page 84. The Reverend John Newton, rector of St. Mary's, Woolworth, who in early life was engaged in the slave trade, and afterwards published a work on the subject, after expressing the opinion that the quote, "far greater part of the wars in Africa would cease if Europeans would cease to tempt them by offering goods for slaves," close quotes, adds, quote, "I believe the captives reserved for sale are fewer than the slain," close quote. Newton on the Slave Trade, London, 1788, page 30. Evidence of a similar character might be indefinitely multiplied, but I close with an incident related, from personal observation, by one of our own countrymen, Mr. Ashman, agent of the American Colonial Society, writing from Liberia in 1823, says, quote, "The following incident I relate not only for its singularity, for similar events take place, perhaps, every month in the year, but it has fallen under my own observation, and I can vouch for its authenticity. King Botswain, our most powerful supporter and steady friend among the natives, received a quantity of goods on trust from a French slaver, for which he stipulated to pay young slaves. He makes it a point of honor to be punctual to his engagements. The time was at hand when he expected the return of the slaver, and he had not the slaves. Looking around on the peaceful tribes about him for his victims, he singled out the Cooks, a small agricultural and trading people of most inoffensive character. His warriors were skillfully distributed to the different hamlets, and making a simultaneous assault on the sleeping occupants in the dead of the night, accomplished, without difficulty or resistance, in 1 hour, the annihilation of the whole tribe. Every adult man and woman was murdered, every hut fired. Very young children generally shared the fate of their parents. The boys and girls alone were reserved to pay the Frenchmen." Close quote. This from Ashman's Life, New York, 1835, page 160. Appendix 2, Note B, page 192. An act of general emancipation with appropriate preamble might be couched somewhat in the terms following: a bill to emancipate persons of African descent held to service or labor in certain of the United States. Whereas there is now flagrant in certain of the United States an insurrection of proportions so gigantic that there has been required, to hold it in check, an increase of the Army and Navy of the United States to an extent seldom paralleled in the history of the world. And whereas, because of the said insurrection, the execution of the laws for collecting taxes and of various other laws of the United States, heretofore enacted by the Congress in the just exercise of their constitutional powers, has been for more than 2 years past, and still is, obstructed and defeated throughout the insurrectionary states. And whereas it is the right and duty of the Congress to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution these said constitutional powers, and whereas the said insurrectionary portions of the Union consist exclusively of states wherein persons of African descent are held in large numbers to involuntary service or labor, the white inhabitants thereof basing their insurrectionary acts upon the assumption that the security and perpetuation of such involuntary servitude require the disruption of the national unity, and the establishment, on a portion of the domain of the United States, of a separate and independent government. And whereas a large portion of the said persons of African descent, so held in servitude, contribute greatly, so long as such involuntary services are thus exacted from them, to the aid and comfort of the said insurgents, laboring for their behoof on their fortifications and for the supply of their commissariat, and otherwise giving strength and support to various insurrectionary acts. And whereas in an emergency so urgent as that which is now patent to the world, it is the duty of the Congress to place at the disposal of the executive branch of the government, for the common defense, the utmost power, civil and military, of the country, and to employ every means not forbidden by the usages of civilized warfare, and not in violation of the Constitution, that is placed within their reach, in order to repress and to bring to a speedy termination the present protracted and desolating insurrection. And whereas it appears from the above recitals that the existence, within any portion of the United States, of a labor system which recognizes the claims of one race of men to the involuntary services of another race, always a moral wrong, has now shown itself to be destructive of the supremacy of the laws and a constant menace to the government, and that the continuance of such labor system eminently jeopardizes the integrity of the Union, and has become incompatible with the domestic tranquillity of the country. And whereas it has thus become evident that claims to the involuntary service or labor of persons of African descent ought not to be possessed by any inhabitant of the United States, but should, in the just exercise of the power which inheres in every independent government, to protect itself from destruction, by seizing and destroying any private property of its citizens or subjects which imperils its own existence, be taken for public use from their present possessors and abrogated and annulled, just compensation being made to so many of the said possessors of such claims, not being nor having been public enemies, as may demand it, and as may by their loyalty be entitled thereto for the claims so abrogated and annulled. And whereas the President of the United States, by proclamation on January 1st, 1863, did declare that all persons held as slaves within the states of Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, certain parishes in Louisiana and certain counties in Virginia excepted, were on that day and thenceforth forever should be free. Therefore, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives and Congress assembled, that the action of the President, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, in issuing his proclamation of January 1st, 1863, as a fit and necessary war measure for the suppression of the existing insurrection, is hereby approved and endorsed, and the emancipation of the slaves thereby effected is recognized and declared to be an act just, legal, and irrevocable. Section 2. And be it further enacted, that from and after the 4th of July next, all claims to the service of labor of persons of African descent, who shall then be held to involuntary labor in any of the states of the Union, under the laws thereof, be and the same are hereby taken by the government of the United States, and the said claims are hereby abrogated and annulled. And all persons of African descent within the United States, who shall on the said 4th day of July next be held to involuntary service or labor, except for crime of which the party shall have been legally convicted, shall be released and emancipated from such claims in as full and complete a manner as if the same had never existed, the said release and emancipation to take effect from and after the said 4th day of July, thenceforth and forevermore. Section 3. And be it further enacted, that the faith of the United States be and the same is hereby pledged for the payment of just compensation to all persons who shall, on the said 4th day of July, hold such claims to service or labor, provided that such persons shall make application for such compensation in form and manner hereinafter to be prescribed, and provided further that such persons are not nor have not been, in law, public enemies of the United States, and provided further that said persons shall have been, throughout the present insurrection, true and loyal to the government of the United States, and shall not, directly or indirectly, have incited to insurrectionary acts, or given aid or comfort to any persons engaged in the insurrection aforesaid. An act couched in the terms here proposed could not be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court without a reckless reversal of principles as well established and of as high authority as any which form the basis of constitutional law, nor without an encroachment of legislative ground so flagrant that it might well subject those members of the court who should give it their official sanction to impeachment on the charge of usurpation. End of Appendices. End of the Wrong of Slavery, the Right of Emancipation, and the Future of the African Race in the United States, by Robert Dale Owen.